So, 2 years ago, I uploaded this video here, April 22nd, 2014, entitled Blender Tutorial Realistic Fire in Cycles. Now, as of the posting of this video, it has around 13,380 views. To me, that is huge. I don't really think I have necessarily a following here on YouTube, but to see that number, and to see some of these great comments down here, just really made me feel good that I had helped some people out. Now, since this is a 2-year-old video, I decided I kind of want to do a recap, partially because, one, I've learned a lot more about the Blender Smoke Simulator. Two, the Blender Smoke Simulator itself has gotten a lot better. And I just wanted to do a little recap, and maybe we can get some better results here. So here's our default Blender scene. We can go ahead and delete the light. And the first thing that I want to do that I actually missed out on in the first video is scaling. Now, this is incredibly important to the Blender Smoke Simulator because without proper scaling, you're going to get some unnatural looking results, and a lot of the time you won't really know why. But this is because you need to set the units. I'm going to set it to feet. You can set it to whatever you want. I know kind of the only country that really uses the imperial system of measurement is going to be the US, and a lot of you aren't going to be based in the US, so just go ahead and set that to whatever you want. I'm going to set it to feet. And that means that each one of these squares on the grid here is 1 foot by 1 foot. So that is going to help immensely in creating a realistic result for both the smoke and the flames. So another thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to scale up the domain object. I'm going to have it about 4 feet across, and I'm also going to scale it on the Z axis as well. We don't want to put it straight right on the grid. Our floor plane is going to be right on the grid. And as I stated previously in the other video, the floor plane here is just so that we can have a indicator that our fire is emitting light, because I think that's one of the really awesome features of rendering smoke in cycles. Now, speaking of cycles, make sure you have your render engine set to cycles. And now, Blender a while ago has gotten support for rendering smoke and fire on the GPU. So if you have a graphics card that's capable, I have a GTX 1080. I'm also, alongside that, I'm running an i7-4790K overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz. So yeah, that's just kind of the basic setup. And of course, you want to add in whatever you want to burn. I'm going to add in the monkey again. And just add in a subdivision here. Do a smooth shading on it. We just kind of move it into position here. Okay. So then we need to select this cube here that we have. We're going to have that as the domain object. So just go ahead and click on smoke here and add it as the domain object. You'll then want to select your monkey head, click on smoke and flow. On flow type, previously I did the fire and smoke, but I've kind of discovered that the fire will also add in a little bit of smoke, and it looks a lot better. This seems to be for fires burning maybe from like oil or some kind of dirty fuel that will emit a lot of black smoke, but for this we're just going to have sort of a normal like bonfire type flames. So I'm going to go ahead and type, or not type, but click here on fire. So right off the bat you can start to play this, and it's at a very low resolution, and you can still see there's a lot of smoke happening here. I'm going to scale down the size of the monkey head. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. And then right off the bat, one thing we're going to need to do is increase the resolution here. I like to increase it at first to a level of 100, but I have gone up to like 250 with a couple smoke high resolution passes as well. We're going to turn on smoke adaptive domain. There's absolutely no reason to not turn that on. We're going to get much better performance with that on, and you'll see that secondary box inside of the domain object there. And what that is a secondary domain. Only where there is smoke and fire will it actually be computing inside that domain, and it saves a lot of compute power. Another thing I like to turn on is dissolve. Now you can play around with this, but I like to set it around 10. Okay. And then another thing I like to change is if you go down into here, if you select the head again, we've got absolute density. Now if you turn that off, oops, you'll see it does a lot of really, like, it just really wafts up, and that's because Blender is not restricted to having the voxel data or the smoke and fire as one density. It can really play with physics the way that it wants to. Now with that, you'll have to change your flame rate down to something like 0.5. I mean, maybe even lower. You really have to kind of play around with this value. I found that it doesn't really change that linearly, so you'll just have to play around with it and see what you like. So just kind of play around with these two values, dissolve and that flame rate as well. I like to also bring this surface value down to something like 0.5, so the flames can be emitted much closer to the actual object. I'm gonna decrease that dissolve, or increase that dissolve time maybe to 20, so we do get some of that smoke wafting up. You can very faintly see it on my screen. Yeah, so that's good. Maybe add a little bit more to that flame rate there, maybe 0.4. There we go. That looks good. Now, another thing that I failed to mention in the other video, or kind of go over, was the smoke flow advanced, which is actually very important to creating a realistic fire. This already looks decent as far as the simulation goes, but the one thing it definitely is missing is that the fact that the entire head, every single square inch of it, is aflame throughout the entire simulation, and that's just outright not realistic unless you're burning some like solid fuel. So we can use the use texture here. Check that. Go into the texture panel here. We're just going to add a new texture. I like to use a clouds texture with a depth of 0, and I like to change that to hard as well. That's all you really need to do there. If you go back into here now and select this texture here, right off the bat, you'll see that only parts of the head are burning now, and that's just wherever the texture is white, it's going to burn. Wherever the texture is black, it's going to not. I like to change the size down to around 0.25. You can see some really interesting things happening in there. Now, with that, you might have to change your flame rate. I like to bump this up and really just kind of play around with values for quite a while until I get something that's pretty convincing. That looks pretty good. Now, another thing is that it's unrealistic now because, yeah, we do have like a sort of a texture and what is burning and what's not, but it's not moving around. It's still very static. So you'll want to use this offset here. Just hover over that and hit I on the keyboard. And then make sure you're on frame 0, of course, before you do that. Slide your frame counter all the way over to frame 250 or whatever be your last frame of the simulation. Click in here and type in, I found that the value of 5 looks pretty good, and then just kind of hit I there. Now, one quirk of Blender that kind of annoys me is that every keyframe that you set is going to have kind of an interpolation mode, whereas in the middle of this animation here, that value will be moving the quickest, and it kind of like ramps up in speed and drops off at the end. That's not appropriate for what we're doing here. It is appropriate for a lot of things, but since a lot of my keyframing is on just this value alone, fire simulation is one of my favorite things to do within Blender. We need to go into the graph editor here, go into key, and change the interpolation mode to linear. And what that will do is it'll just have a constant growth of that number from 0 to 5. And you'll see something that looks a lot better. So now if we play this, you'll see that different parts of our flame, or different parts of our object are burning at different times, and that can create much more dynamic and good-looking flames. Now you can go ahead and play around with that value. I'll show you how. If you go to the very end of the frame here, you can actually just reset this key. I might even try something like 2.5, and you can just hit I on that again, and it'll change that keyframe there. So now we can see that looks pretty good. You can look in areas like this under it, and it just creates much more dynamic flames. So our simulation is pretty much done. We do need to do a bake of it. You can change some of these values in here. The vorticity is one that I do like to change. If we bring that all the way up to 2, which is actually the highest it will go on that, you'll see that the flames act a little bit more dynamically. A little bit more interesting things happening there. Some of it is kind of wafting out into the sides and rising faster than other parts of it. That's pretty cool. We can then add in the smoke high resolution. This is a very important part. My stance on this noise method strength still stands when it comes to like a bonfire type of flame. You do want to bring that down to a very low value, if not 0. You can play around with the divisions. Don't go too crazy. I wouldn't bring this past 3. Your computer's going to chug hard. Like I said, I'm running an i7-4790K that's overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz, and this can still bring the system kind of to its knees. So if we look at this now, you can see we do have some ugly stepping happening in here, and that can be alleviated really well by utilizing within the smoke settings for the flow. We can utilize the subframes. Now what that does is kind of create extra frames in between frames, and that can really smooth out that stepping. Sometimes you might have to go a little crazy with it. It just depends on what you're doing. Like I said, I wouldn't go to a value too incredibly high because that will increase your render time and your bake time. We have a lot of that stepping going on, and it might have something to do with the vorticity, so I'm going to go ahead and play around with that setting. Maybe we bring that vorticity down back to 0. No, stepping's still there. So just play around with this. You can bring your resolution down to 80, and then your smoke high resolution up. You can kind of play around almost with the scale or the perceived scale of the flames with those two things here. The lower resolution you have here, the more simple your flames are going to look. The higher here, the less pixelated your flames are going to look per se. So that's good for now. I'm going to do a quick bake of this. To bake it, you will have to save. So I'm just going to do a quick save here. Fire cut. I'm going to bring this back to frame 1 and do a quick bake here. I do like to use the OpenVDB file format that has come out now. You're just going to have lower file sizes, and it seems to kind of have a little bit better, at least on my system, it does perform a little bit better. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on the Bake All Dynamics, and we can just wait for that to finish. I'll speed this footage up here. Okay, so our simulation has finished baking, and we can do a quick playback of it with Alt-A. We do have some of that nasty stepping in there. I'll see if I can post a video later on to kind of alleviate that, but I think we have a really nice looking simulation here. As you can see, Blender has come leaps and bounds as far as the code base and how it does this. It really has improved quite a bit over the past couple of years. It's something I've been watching really closely. So that being said, we can get into the rendering portion of this video, creating the shader and things like that. One of the things I like to do when I'm creating a fire simulation is bring the world color value down all the way to black, and that can help immensely in just being able to visualize both our smoke and fire without it blending in kind of into the background, especially the smoke of our scene. So if we add in a lamp here, I'm just going to do a simple lamp, point lamp. I'm going to position that sort of in front of the camera and above there. What that'll do is it'll add in some lighting for us to see our smoke. Now the smoke will be also lit up by the light coming from the flames as well, but it does help to have some outside lighting happening as well. What I've done there is just position the camera and flew around there just to get a good view of what's going on here, and that's actually pretty good. So yeah, we can get right into the node editing portion of the video. We'll just split the area down here. You can do that by right-clicking and click here, go into the node editor, make sure that your domain object is selected, and check this box here that says use nodes. Right off the bat, we want to delete the diffuse material. That's default, and we want to add in a couple attribute nodes. The first one, density, and the second one, flame. One thing I forgot to mention in the previous video is make sure that you're typed in exactly as you see here, no capital letters, and of course spelled correctly, otherwise Blender will not recognize the data and it will not render it properly. That being out of the way, let's go ahead and add in our smoke shader. So we want to add in a volume scatter node and a volume absorption node. We want to plug this factor into both of them, into the density, and we also want the color for now to be white on both of those. I'm also going to do a quick little trick that I learned years ago. If you hold down shift, left click and drag down on these two connector points, you'll see that you get a thing here. This doesn't actually change the outcome of the render, however this will allow you to add like a string of different modifiers on this to make the smoke look a little better. Now since there's not a lot of smoke in this, you just see it just barely in here, we won't have to worry that much about the smoke shader, so I'm going to do a very simple setup on this. We want to add in an add shader. You do not want a mix shader, as I stated in my previous video. I kind of did that on a whim. An add shader usually comes out with better looking results, as I've learned. You just plug that now into the volume shader, and you should see some of the smoke starting to appear in your render. Now another thing that I like to do is add in a couple modifiers, like I said, to this. The first, a brightness and contrast, and in front of that I like to add in a, if you go to converter, math, multiply, which is probably my most used node ever. You can increase this value something past 1. Just kind of play around with that, as well as the contrast. You can bring that up to maybe 0.5, and that's just going to make our smoke, let's bring this value up here. So our goal is to kind of make the smoke more or less look like it does in the viewport, like where we can only see some of the smoke happening in here. I found that the viewport looks pretty good. So if we pump up this value to something like 5 or 10, you'll see that we get some really nice, interesting smoke going on. We can also bring that contrast up to maybe 0.7. Just kind of play around with these values. That looks pretty darn good. I like that a lot. So then we're done with the smoke portion. If we take our attribute node here with the flame, now I'm going to do two kind of versions of this fire shader. One gives you more artistic control, one is quick and easy, and it also correlates to optical physics and what actually happens in real world lighting. What I'm talking about, of course, is a black body shader. Now, a lot of you haven't heard of that. I'm going to go ahead and add that in now. If you go to converter, it's the first one here called black body. What this node does, and I just figured this out I was actually going through the previous video's comments last night, just kind of reminiscing on it, and I did see one guy on here. Where was it at? He mentioned the black body node somewhere. But thanks to him, I kind of did some yeah, I can't find it, but it is in there somewhere. You can go to my previous video and find it if you want. But thanks to him or her, I did do some research last night on the black body node, and what it does is it will actually convert temperature in Kelvin to a visible wavelength or color of light, which is really interesting because we can use a new attribute that's been added recently, or somewhat recently, from the smoke simulator, which is heat. And that very obviously you can use then the heat of the fire to actually color it, which is really interesting. I did do a test of it last night. I haven't gotten it completely down pat, but I figured I would show you guys that. So I'm just going to put that down there for now, and we can get to that later. For now, I'm just going to do my normal smoke, or I mean fire shader. Gives me a little bit more artistic control. You can also create, like green flames and things like that with it as well, if you're wanting to like burn certain chemicals and whatnot. So let's get right into it. We want to add an emission shader, and just plug this factor into the strength here. And we'll also want another add shader here. And plug that in there. And right off the bat, you can see our flames begin to emit light, and you can see that down here as well. You can see some of that lighting happening. One problem I'm kind of noticing, which won't make a lot of sense once the render is finished, or once the render is actually going with the smoke being illuminated and the flames illuminating everything around it, is that this shadow down here, and that's just made by this lamp here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to not cast a shadow from that light, just for the purposes of, like I said, just that light is just for the purposes of kind of lighting up some of that smoke that won't be lit up by just the flames themselves. So we can go ahead and start playing around with our fire shader now. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a converter color ramp. And, oops, that was not supposed to happen. There we go. Okay, so then we can plug this factor into there, plug the color into the color of the emission. I like to change, actually I like to keep that that black there. What is going on? Okay, sometimes that can happen when you're using freeware. No offense to Blender, but little things can happen like that. It might be because I'm recording using GeForce Experience. I believe it's called Shadow Play. So far, it's been a really great, easy way to record. But within this color ramp, you can just add some flame color. I like to bring this brightness value up for every part of the flame that's going to be, the flame here. Just so that we're not getting some like dirty looking gross colors. Add in like an orangey red, not particularly like all the way red, but like an orange red, kind of at this side of the thing here. I do like to add in, as I previously stated, like a brown color right up next to that, and that's just going to help add some contrast on the outside of the flames. We can then add in sort of a yellowy color, and that should, let's do a quick save there, that should already start to look pretty decent. Now we are going to need to add some different things to this line here to make this fire really pop. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a converter math, again a multiply node. and just start to kind of play around with that value. I found that a value of 7 usually looks pretty darn good. And then I also like to add in a brightness and contrast to that as well. Just kind of bump up the contrast a bit, maybe 0.5. And there we go. We start to have some illuminated fire going on. So that is the kind of complete node setup. I'll kind of compact it here so we can see it better. That is the complete node setup for what you need. Now obviously you can add in things, you can remove things, you can play around with it. Ultimately I'd like you to create in your own way. I don't like to follow rules when it comes to art. I don't think that's what art is about. So yeah, just kind of play around with it and do whatever you'd like. Now getting to this black body node here. I found that the code coming out of the heat is kind of to a -2 to 2. That's the minimum and maximum value, and obviously a -2 Kelvin would be not fire at all. So what we want to do is make some changes to that data before we actually plug it into the black body node and use it as the color for our emission. So if we add in first a converter, math, and actually an add node, plug this value in here and add 1. We then want to add in, I'll just duplicate this and I'll change it to a multiply node. We'll plug that value in there. And I found a value of around 1,000 to 1,800. Works pretty well for creating flames. And we'll just want to replace that color in there. Now as you can see, it's not going to look as good right off the bat. This isn't something that I've played around with a lot. Like I said, like just last night I discovered this. But if you play around with the temperature or the multiply, you'll find that the color changes. Maybe something like 1,300, 1,400, oops, 140, 1,400. And that looks pretty good as well. So that's just kind of a quick and easy way to do it. I found so far that I do like this method a lot more because you can really just play around with it pretty hardcore and just change it completely based on your preferences, and you're not clamped down by just a limited node setup here. So that's the major difference there. And like I said, I like the brightness. I like the brightness that's happening from this a lot more, but that can also be, alleviated here if we multiply this by something like 10, maybe even 15. You'll see that starts to really pop out. And I think just as of yet, this isn't developed enough to really use as a main workflow, but it is something that's really fun to kind of play around with and see how it works. But that's pretty much it, guys. Should have been maybe a quicker tutorial than last time, but that's our fire. It looks way better than what I've previously been able to accomplish, and I'm happy that it's getting better. So yeah, if you guys have any questions at all, any further requests for tutorials. Now I know I don't really have a huge following, but and that's not really my goal. I just want to reach as many people as possible and help as many people as possible who are looking to get into Blender or any other CG work. I will be doing more of an advanced tutorial. It will go way more in depth with these smoke settings, these fire settings, and also the way they are emitted. I've discovered one really good way to make a really nice fire is, especially like in my bonfire scene that I had posted on Facebook. Now I might put an image of that in this video to kind of show you, but the logs in that scene are, I used a particle system with a dynamic paint enabled, and I actually used the data from that dynamic paint to dictate where the logs were burning and where they were not. And that just right off the bat will make something a lot more realistic. If you look at a bonfire, not the entirety of the logs are burning until quite into the burning process. And the dynamic paint can really help in creating like a natural fire spread, and ultimately a better look. So I will be creating that video as soon as I can. I do have a pretty tight work schedule. I work at Best Buy. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, put a comment down below. If you liked the video, please give me a like. If you liked it a ton, share it with everybody you can. And that is it. This is Brandon, and see you guys later.